We can now move to the Arizona Judiciary, another branch of the Arizona government. Now, the drafters of the Constitution, who again were followers of the progressive movement, gave the court system tremendous power in order to keep the legislative and executive powers in check. Now, similar to the functions that the judiciary holds in the federal judiciary that were mentioned in the presentation on the federal judiciary, those same functions or roles are played by the courts here in Arizona. And that is to uphold the rule of law, which holds all elected officials accountable to the same law that the citizens are held to, settle disputes and enforce contracts, to engage in social control, and to conduct judicial review of the legislative or the governmental process itself. The courts in Arizona perform these functions just as the federal courts perform these functions. When the founders wrote the Constitution, they wanted to make sure that the judicial branch remained independent and did not become captured by the mining and railroad interests that had so plagued the territorial legislature. And so in the Constitution, they created a Commission on Judicial Conduct. The slide shows a screenshot from their website. And what this commission's job is to do is function as an oversight agency on the judiciary in Arizona. If there is a complaint lodged against a judge that they have behaved unethically or illegally, this commission will investigate that complaint. And if they determine that the judge has engaged in some type of misconduct, they will penalize the judge with a fine or a suspension, and they even have the authority to initiate proceedings to remove the judge from the bench. The founders believed that this commission would keep judges honest and prevent them from working on behalf of moneyed interests in the state. Now, this commission receives hundreds of complaints every year about judges in Arizona. Most of those complaints, however, are from people who just don't like the judge they had or disagree with the decision that the judge has made. Very rarely does the commission punish a judge for misconduct, and only in a few cases have they actually removed judges from the bench. But knowing they exist could present a check on potential malfeasance on the part of judges in Arizona. There are a few different kinds of courts in Arizona, and we will look at each of these in turn. There are limited jurisdiction courts, so these are courts that can only look at certain types of cases. Then there are superior courts, which are the sort of bread and butter everyday courts. Then there are the appellate courts, who hear appeals of cases from the superior court. And then there is the Supreme Court. So we will look at each of these in turn. The limited jurisdiction courts are the Justice of the Peace and the municipal courts. Now, the Justice of the Peace is another unique function of the Arizona system. The Justice of the Peace, or JPs, as they're called, are elected officials. So all of the other judges in the Arizona system are appointed, but the JPs are elected. The Constitution only provides a few qualifications for a JP. You have to be 35 and speak English, I believe, are the only two qualifications to be a JP. There is no education requirement. There's no experience requirement. As long as you are breathing and a citizen, basically, and can win an election, you too can be a justice of the peace. Now, it's a limited jurisdiction court, which means they're only able to look at certain types of cases. So, as the slide suggests, they do traffic violations. They can do minor criminal course cases, like juvenile stuff, property damage, things of that nature. And they can handle small claims disputes. So disputes that are typically under $5,000 can be tried with the Justice of the Peace. Now, the Justice of the Peace would be a much less formal setting than a regular court would be, and would have a quicker turnaround time. They do not have as long of a docket. Another thing that the Justice of the Peace does is when somebody needs to be evicted from their home or apartment, the Justice of the Peace is the one who delivers that notice and helps evict the tenant. So they do earn their money, apparently. It pays quite well, actually. The other kind of court is the municipal court. So those are city courts. They handle traffic violations, minor criminal violations, and city laws and codes. So when you get that letter in the mail from the red light camera or the speeding camera, it's typically issued by a municipal court that handles those kinds of violations. Now, they're limited jurisdiction, so anything beyond those categories, they do not have the authority to make a decision on. For that, you have to go to a court with a higher level of jurisdiction. The superior courts are the workaday courts. Most of the cases heard in Arizona are heard in superior courts. So they handle, as the slide suggests, more serious crimes. They also handle civil cases such as contract disputes, custody battles, divorce hearings, things of those natures. They also are the probate judges to settle estates. And if anyone has an appeal from a JP or a municipal court, a superior court can hear those appeals. So the superior court judges handle a variety of cases. They tend to rotate from one type of case to the next. So a judge will serve in family court for a while, and then they will serve in the criminal court for a while, and then they will serve in probate court for a while, and so forth. So the judges develop expertise, but also are able to move around from one type of law or one type of case to another. Next, we have the appellate courts. The appellate courts, as the name suggests, handle appeals from the superior courts. And recall the discussion in the presentation on the federal judiciary. Appeals cannot be made just because you don't like the outcome of the case or because you don't like the judge that you were assigned. You have to have a procedural basis for your appeal. That is, you have to make an argument that the process was flawed in some way, in the way the judge handled your case at the lower level court. So the superior court hears those appeals to ensure that the processes were followed correctly at the superior court level. Now, in addition, the appellate court does have original jurisdiction over a few types of case law, and those are listed there on the slide. The tax court industrial commission, and unemployment compensation. So those cases, which are frequently statewide concerns, are handled at the appellate court level rather than the superior court level. The Arizona Supreme Court functions similar to the federal Supreme Court in that it is the court of last resort for cases originating in Arizona. It is possible to appeal an Arizona Supreme Court decision to the federal Supreme Court, but only if the case involves a constitutional issue of some kind. Otherwise, the Arizona Supreme Court decision is the end of the road for cases. So the Supreme Court hears appeals from the appellate court, and in addition, the Supreme Court does have original jurisdiction in a few areas, and those are lawsuits against state officials and lawsuits between counties. So in those cases, the case is heard in the Supreme Court, not the superior courts or the appellate courts. Additionally, the Supreme Court is responsible for the conduct and administration of all of the lower courts. So that gives the Supreme Court an oversight role over the conduct of these other judges. Now, this overlaps in a way with that earlier commission on judicial conduct that was set up by the Constitution. What typically happens is if there is a complaint about a judge, the Commission on Judicial Conduct will investigate that complaint, and if it determines that that complaint has merit and the judge has engaged in unethical or illegal behavior, then the Commission will turn that case over to the Supreme Court for a punishment of some kind. The Supreme Court then is responsible for the maintenance and for upholding the integrity of the courts throughout the state. Now, by administration, what that means is that the Supreme Court handles the budget for the lower level courts. A few years ago, it was determined that the justices of the peace were abusing their offices. Several of them were anyways. The JPs were each given a secretary, and the secretary was given, under an extreme circumstances, the authority to sign the name of the JP. Well, what some JPs were doing is they would go into their office and sign a paper giving their secretary the authority to sign all of their documents, and then leaving and playing golf all day. And for that, they were receiving their handsome salary as a justice of the peace without actually doing any work. So when the Supreme Court heard about that, they investigated, found that there was a problem with it, and so they changed the structure of how JPs are run. And now justices of the peace have to share a secretary. So there's 2 JPs for every secretary. That dramatically decreases the possibility that a secretary is going to be abused in that way, and that a JP will abdicate their authority in that way. So that's an example of how the Supreme Court keeps track of how the lower courts are running their businesses and taking care of their caseloads and intervening when necessary to provide corrective measures to, again, maintain the integrity of the judicial process in the state of Arizona. The process for judicial selection is quite similar to the same process that has already been described at the federal level. namely the governor appoints a judge and the legislature confirms that appointment. That judge is then in office for a lifetime appointment, with the exception of retention, which we'll talk about in just a minute. Now, there is an exception to how judges are selected, and that is the justices of the peace. As mentioned earlier, they are elected. They stand for election. Their terms of office run out, and they have to be re-elected at the end of those terms. But other than that, in all other regards, the process is not fundamentally different at the state level than it is at the federal level. That has already been described. The judicial retention process is something that is rather unique to Arizona. No other state that I'm aware of anyways has a process where judges have to stand to be retained in their office. Now again, the judges are appointed by the governor and confirmed by the legislature, and they then hold that job until they retire. However, every few years, that judge has to go before the voters in a retention ballot. And all of the superior and appellate court judges that reside or work within a particular county will have to stand for retention in that county's elections. The judges are almost always reappointed. Very seldom will a judge lose this election. But the fact that they have to stand provides citizens with a way to eliminate a judge who they feel is just a bad judge. Now, most citizens don't really have any meaningful way to assess a good judge versus a bad judge. I mean, they may not like a judge's ruling, but that doesn't make them a bad judge. It just means you disagreed with them in that case. So, to facilitate that vote, the Arizona State Bar issues a publication prior to each election where they evaluate each of the judges that are up for retention and provide in the voter information packet a score for each judge. And the members of the Arizona State Bar will basically vote on whether or not they would like to retain the judge. And then the percentage outcome of that vote is reported to the citizens. And so as you're going to vote, it's always a good idea to take a look at that voter information packet prior to voting so that you can look through those evaluations and decide if there are any judges that you feel should not be retained in that election. This slide shows a picture of a previous ballot to see the judges that are up for retention. This concludes our discussion of the Arizona legislative and judicial branches. Now, in their basic structure and function, the Arizona legislature and judicial branches appear quite similar to the federal judiciary and legislative branches. They are different, though, in key aspects or regards, and understanding these differences helps explain some of the outcomes of political battles in Arizona, as well as suggesting pathways for citizen action to effectively advocate for policies that you personally agree with, or as teachers advocate for policies that you feel are necessary to the conduct of your profession. It's important to know the processes that are followed as public policy is made, so that you can know how to most effectively engage that process and succeed in achieving your policy preference. This presentation is courtesy of Brian Dilley. I'm the speaker, and I'm a professor of political science at Mesa Community College, a college of the Maricopa Community College District in Mesa, Arizona. I hope you've enjoyed this presentation.